Robert Tercek is just an outstanding individual. So many things to say to describe him, but briefly, a digital media pioneer, the author of Vaporized, a much sought after speaker around the globe, and a strategic consultant to numerous organizations, including Microsoft, Google, IBM, PBS, NBC, Toyota, Ford, and many, many more. I promised him I wouldn't draw out this introduction too long, but felt we should at least acknowledge what an outstanding person he is. And I believe you have just a wonderful treat ahead of you with Robert Tercek. So, Mr. Tercek.
Hi, Lee. Good morning. Good morning to everybody at NEBSA. It's a great pleasure to be back. Thank you for including me in your program. I've been a fan of Lee's for a long time, and I really respect the great work that NEBSA does. And I was thinking that as broadband providers, today you'd be interested to understand some of the trends in network software, the businesses that are built on top of broadband networks. And so I'm going to share with you a forecast for what I think is going to happen over the next 10 years. Now, I'm going to give you a lot of information. So here's what I recommend we do. Let me take questions at the end of the talk. So I'll stick around at the end and we can talk a little bit about what I present. But for you right now, I'm just going to give you a wild ride through a glimpse of the near future. And to do that, I'm going to use some slides. My talk today is about the race for the next trillion-dollar platform. This is a time where there are trillion-dollar companies out there. So I'm going to share some scenarios with you about how that will play out. But I want to start with a note of caution. About 120 years ago in the New York Times, there was an editorial essay written on December 8th, 1903 that said, "Man won't fly for 1,000,000 years." A bold prediction that was proven wrong just 10 days later when the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. And the point is simple. It's really easy to make predictions, but it's really hard to make an accurate forecast. There's a big distinction there. A prediction is just a wild guess about what's going to happen. A forecast is a scenario where we try to think carefully about all the factors that are going to drive it and then assign probabilities to that. We also try to assign a timeline to that. And today I'm going to undertake doing that. But it's really hard to do. One example of this is the magazine Wired. I have copies going back to the very first issue in 1993. And what I notice is that just about every other month, they're wrong. They make predictions on the cover every month. And as you can see from these examples right here, we still use password. This is not the end of the code. The web is not dead. Famously, right before the dot-com crash, they ran a cover story called The Long Boom, and so forth. So even Wired magazine, arguably the best editors covering the tech space, even they get it wrong. It's tough to make accurate forecasts. One of the reasons that's so hard to do is that the future isn't predefined. There's a lot of different organizations that are vying to control the future or influence the future in some way. And so you can think of it as a competitive thing, like a race. And that's how I think about it today, a race for the future. And in the time that we're in, it's additionally complicated by other factors. Now, the future that lies ahead of us is going to be richer and more immersive and probably more three-dimensional. And there are a lot of ways to describe this, the vision or the scenarios that people are talking about for the future of the web. Sometimes it's called the real-time 3D web. So the idea there is that we'll move beyond the kind of rectangular layouts of web pages today and mobile apps today and get into something that's more immersive. Sometimes it's referred to as augmented reality, virtual reality, extended reality, and so forth. You've heard those terms. You've also heard about digital twins, which are high-fidelity replications of the real world, but in digital software. So think of those as immersive models. And lately, we've been hearing a lot about the Metaverse, and I'll have something to say about that as well. But these are all manifestations of the real-time 3D web. So that's clearly a thing that's coming in the future. But as I said, it's hard to make forecasts at this time because we live in an era of instability. And I'm not just referring to the events that are going on right now in the Ukraine. There's instability all over the world. Bear in mind that we're living at a time of unprecedented climate change. Here in California, we seem to have huge fires every single summer, as they do in Australia and a number of other countries around the world. Elsewhere, there's floods. And of course, we're still living through a global pandemic that has upended half the businesses on the planet. There's rising income inequality. And we seem to be in the habit right now of demolishing institutions that have served us well, that have provided stability for 70 years in the post-war order. What we haven't done so well is build new institutions to replace them. And then here in the digital space, we seem to be under constant assault. People are constantly hacking and attempting to get into our networks and steal our precious data. So there's that element of instability to deal with as well. There's people out there trying to mess your stuff up. These days, no one knows who to trust. And this is adding its own element of instability. It's very hard to run a democracy when you can't even trust the facts. So when we look at the future, when we think about what's coming next, it's important to understand the future is not a book. It's not preordained. There's no script. There's nothing to read. You can't look in a crystal ball or read a palm. The future is a process. It's going to unfold, and many factors are going to influence it. Now, I'm a little more proactive. As Lee said, in my career, I've designed and launched a lot of different services. And so I've had the ability to influence the future. And I believe the future is something that we can envision, invent, actively design, and co-create and build. It's something that's intentional. In other words, we have an idea for the future and we go out and make it. When I think about what's coming next, when I try to anticipate future trends, I try to look at the long-term trends that are shaping the world around us right now and extrapolate out how those might unfold. It's hard to do because, of course, they intersect. Today, what I want to do is draw your attention to 3 long-term trends that I believe are going to have a big influence on the future. The first one is dematerialization. The second is decentralization, and all this points to democratization of technology, putting the technology in the hands of people to use for themselves. Let's get into it. The first topic then is dematerialization. It's a topic I'm really, really fascinated by. I've been studying it for more than 10 years, and as Lee mentioned, I wrote a book on the subject. Dematerialization is turning physical stuff into software. I was inspired by Buckminster Fuller, who many years ago in the 1920s said we have to do more with less, and argued for using less and less material, eventually replacing it with just wireless. So his predictions, his forecasts have come true. Over the last 70 years, we've seen miniaturization take hold in a number of fields. Here's a great illustration of miniaturization. Back in the 1950s, a hard drive, just a 5 megabyte hard drive, was so big it needed a forklift to put it on an airplane, and it cost $120,000. We've seen a 200 billion fold improvement in 60 years, shrinking that hard drive down to something the size of a quarter and can hold a terabyte of data, and it costs just less than $100. That's not all. That trend's going to continue. It'll persist into the future when we start to shift over to DNA hard drives, storing data in DNA. And they said that's an immensely large storage possibility. You could hold all of the world's data, the entire internet, in a teaspoon of DNA. So that's miniaturization, but that's only one aspect of dematerialization. I think dematerialization is the most important trend of the 21st century. And in a minute, I'll show you why I think that's the case. But that's such a big word, dematerialization. I like to call it vaporized. That's the term I prefer. It's the name of my book. And that's what I'm most excited about, this idea that we're going to replace physical stuff with invisible data that's available over the air. It's information as atmosphere. When you look at your mobile phone, you can add a new feature to your phone just by touching an icon. You can download stuff wirelessly into your phone that replaces something physical that you used to buy in a store. And we've all experienced this ourselves. You've seen this happen over the course of the last 10 years. Books have been vaporized. Music has been vaporized. Maps have been vaporized. And the video business is in the process of being vaporized right now, replaced by streaming video services. So when I'm talking about dematerialization into software, what I'm saying is that we're taking something that used to be sold in a physical form, like a disk or a drive or a book, and we're replacing it with software that you can download instantly over the air. This process is not limited to maps, media, and music. It extends to physical devices as well. So your smartphone keeps getting smarter. Over the course of the past 10 years, your smartphone has absorbed the feature functionality of literally dozens of consumer electronics devices. Those have all been replaced as software inside the phone. And as a result, the companies that manufacture consumer electronics have experienced double-digit decreases in sales. They've been crushed by the fact that mobile phones have absorbed that functionality. So in a period of time, over a span of a decade, the first decade of the smartphone, while those companies that made MP3 players and digital cameras and nav systems experienced tremendous declines in sales, smartphone sales, of course, surged 500-fold. Now, in economics, the term they use for this is demand destruction. And demand destruction used to be quite rare. In fact, the example mostly used in economics textbooks is the shift from a internal combustion automobile, a car that uses gasoline as fuel, When you shift over to an electric vehicle, you've destroyed your demand for gasoline. You just don't need to go to a gas station anymore because you're using an electric car. So that's a typical example, but that used to be quite rare. Now with the smartphone, we're doing demand destruction on an epic scale. We simply don't need to stop and buy the stuff that we used to buy in stores. Once you notice this process, you start to see it everywhere, but it is an invisible process. So you sort of have to open your eyes to notice it. So for example, Uber is a good example of vaporization. And what's being vaporized isn't the car per se, it's the ownership. It's also the switchboard, the dispatcher. When young people start using Uber, now they're using it before they even have at the right age to drive a car or get a motor vehicle license. They get in the habit of summoning a car. You can have transportation on demand just by touching an icon on your phone. And as a result, they're not in the habit of buying or leasing a car. That means they're going to buy fewer cars over their lifetime. And this is a gigantic problem for the auto industry. Another example in a completely different area of our lives is dating. So today, in many countries, including the United States, the number one way for couples of any gender, any orientation to meet is through a mobile app. Now, during the pandemic, we also had another experience of vaporization, one that I've been excited about for some time. And then when the pandemic struck, we all had to rely on right away, which is the ability to talk to your doctor, telemedicine, talk to your doctor via your phone. During the pandemic, nobody wanted to go to the clinic. That's where all the sick people were. So we wanted to stay clear of that place. And so we started to do doctor visits on our phone. And in some places, they're now actually replacing that doctor with artificial intelligence. Coming out of the pandemic, when you go to a hotel for your next in-person conference, you'll notice the hotels have changed as well. The hotels have dematerialized a lot of services that used to be provided at the front desk or at the concierge desk. Today, the hotels expect you to have a smartphone and they expect you to order that stuff using an app, and therefore they don't have restaurants on site. They often don't have in-suite entertainment services. Instead, they expect you to stream Netflix. If you need to get a ride to the airport, you're probably going to book that using a rideshare thing. And so the hotels have changed as well during the pandemic. You start to see examples of vaporization everywhere you look, this idea of replacing physical things with software. There's huge implications here for broadband providers because all of this stuff is running on your network. All of this is a business for your network. Now, I believe that anything that can be replaced by software will be. Whatever can be vaporized will be. And that is a big business. Let's take a look at how big that business can be. So just in the past 5 years, we've seen it grow about sixfold. And, this is just the app economy on mobile phones. It doesn't even encompass all of the stuff that's being replaced by software. And as for the companies that provide these apps, well, they've been enjoying a banner time the past decade. Back in 2000, Apple Computers was worth $5 billion. The company experienced a 100-fold increase in value after the introduction of the iPhone in 2007. And by 2016, Apple was worth $570 billion, and it was the most valuable company on the planet. Now, in the previous decade, just 10 years before, this chart of the most valuable companies stack ranked by market capitalization, this chart would have been dominated by banks and energy companies. Microsoft was the only company in the 1990s and the 2000s that was in the top 10 evaluated companies. But by the middle of the 2010s, we saw that it was mostly tech companies that were the most valuable companies on the planet. Now, what happened after this is really quite extraordinary. As the app economy grew and as people around the world started to purchase smartphones and join wireless broadband networks, these companies grew tremendously fast. By 2018, this is the middle of 2018, Apple had added $250 billion to its market cap. And that's also true for Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon. But that's not all. By August of 2018, Apple became the first company in the world to hit the $1 trillion valuation. And they weren't the only ones. Just a few weeks later, Amazon touched $1 trillion in value as well. And at that point, I remember very clearly, people were skeptical that there could be a company worth that much money. There hadn't been one ever listed in the stock exchange before that. But it just kept growing from there. Just before the pandemic, in January 2020, Apple was valued at $1.4 trillion. Alphabet, Microsoft, and Amazon had all crossed the $1 trillion threshold and were bumping around that valuation at that time. Only Facebook languished for a lot of reasons. At that time, they were under investigation and antitrust lawsuits and so forth. But what happened during the pandemic? What happened in the last 2 years? What happened is extraordinary. What happened is that I need a bigger chart or I need a bigger screen because Apple's grown to 2.7 trillion. They're hovering around $3 trillion in valuation. And Alphabet, Microsoft, and Amazon also hover around a 2 trillion valuation, somewhere between 1.5 and $2 trillion in value. Only Facebook has shrunk, and I'll get into that in a moment. We'll come back to Facebook in just a moment. But first, let me continue because I want to tell you more about what these companies are about to do next. So what's happened over the past 10 years, or maybe even longer, is that the big information companies in Washington and in California and also in China have built intangible or invisible information empires, and they've built them on your networks. They built them using the wireless network and the broadband network. And these are now planetary scale companies, global scale companies that reach just about every nation on Earth. People speculate that Apple's going to continue to grow. There's already articles now that speculate that Apple will cross the $5 trillion threshold. Folks, this is unprecedented. This is a really extraordinary achievement. And we have to consider carefully, how are they going to get there? How is Apple going to achieve a valuation north of $5 trillion? Well, there's a couple different scenarios, and that's what I want to talk to you about. So the big question is, who's next? Who's in the gun sights of these big technology companies? They've already made sweeping changes to media, advertising, retail, and so forth. What's next is groceries and retail. According to Kathy Wood at ARC Research, there's $2 trillion at risk. And of course, retail famously has been disrupted around the world, but that process is not done yet, and it will continue for the next 10 years. Banking and payments is currently being unbundled, previously protected by regulation. These businesses are now under assault. About $3 trillion is at risk in the banking and payments sector. The healthcare business, bloated, inefficient, and a lousy consumer experience, is ripe for disruption. And there's about $8 trillion at risk. And the transportation sector. We already know that robot vehicles have been tested now for nearly 20 years. And they're getting close to deployment. Some places are already being deployed in limited usage. We also know that Apple has some top secret auto project in the works as well. There's $8 trillion at risk in the transportation business. So we can expect to see some or all of these sectors get reconfigured. But the big kahuna, the big one that's out there, is the global supply chain, $40 trillion supply chain spanning the entire planet. And there have been tremendous changes during the pandemic. We're all familiar with robots in auto factories. Robots have been a feature of auto factories for nearly 30 years. And now today, if you go to the body plant of a major auto manufacturer, you'll notice there are very few people there. They keep the people out because robots are actually quite dangerous. But those robots now are starting to expand into many other factories. For instance, Adidas, the shoe company, is now building robotic factories in Asia to build certain kinds of shoes. So it's extending into other fields. But it's not just the robots in the factories. Robots are leaving the factory and they're actually coming down the streets near you. Waymo and Uber are developing robot trucking services. And there's a lot of speculation that the first widely deployed robot vehicles will be trucks for long haul. Those robot trucks will be competing with robot railroads already now in Western Australia, where they move huge amounts of material long distance across the outback. They have already started to robotize trains. And if you think about it, a train actually makes a great deal of sense. It's something you can robotize. Another place where robotics have been deployed during the pandemic is in ports, container ports around the world. What you're seeing here are those cranes, but these are robotic cranes in Shanghai. And they're deployed now around the world in ports. About 7 years ago, when I started looking at the supply chain, I noticed that there was an initiative by Maersk, the big shipping company, to develop a robot container ship. And a lot of people thought that was silly. They thought that would never happen. They couldn't understand how you could possibly have a robot transport ship, container ship. Today, all 8 shipping companies have some form of robotic shipping project underway. These aren't necessarily deployed yet. But the notion is that you can send a container around the world at a much slower speed, a speed that's so slow that a human crew would not tolerate it. But they could do that at great cost and at greater safety. And of course, we also have robot warehouses. Famously, Amazon acquired Kiva Robotics. But robot warehouses now are a feature for just about every company in the logistics and warehouse business. If you haven't seen Ocado, I recommend you look at the video for this on YouTube because it's really quite an elegant symphony of little robot containers that are moving things around inside of a warehouse without any human intervention. And finally, robots are actually starting to hit the floor of stores. You might see an inventory robot or even a customer care robot in a grocery store near you in the near future. So the entire global supply chain now is being transformed by robotics and automation. And gradually that system will be connected and you'll start to see it digitized. And as each element is robotized, we're adding in data analytics. We're able to capture minute scale data. Tremendous amounts of data flows from every ship, every container ship, every airplane, every major industrial facility, like an energy plant or a gas turbine. When we capture all that data, we're able to build a digital twin. And this is another area of exploitation, another area where the big tech companies intend to grow, building high fidelity replicas of the real world around us, using that data, the telemetry data that flows from those machines. And what's remarkable about this is that as we start to stitch these things together, as the digital twins of every step in the supply chain are connected together, we're going to start to build out a kind of nervous system for the entire planet. You can think of it as just like the nervous system in your body, but it's now going to scale continents and oceans and link all those supply chains together digitally. So that's one big project for the next 10 years. To summarize that, I would say that software models have been around for many decades, but previously the software models were confined to computers or networks, but now the software models operate in the real world. They operate on the real world. Typically, we now use the digital twin to govern the real world installation, and that's a big change. So that's one area for growth. It's not the only scenario. There's another scenario. Have you heard of super apps? Some people have, some haven't. There's the possibility now that big companies like Alphabet, Apple, Amazon are going to introduce a super app. What's a super app, you might ask? Well, here in the United States, we're familiar with standalone apps, the kind that you would get in the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. A standalone app that you can download to your phone that does one thing really, really well. But increasingly, you might notice that companies like Adobe and Microsoft are introducing what we call an app suite. This is a group of apps, standalone apps, but they work well together. You can log on to them, you can share documents or work easily from one to another. So that's kind of state of the game here in the US and in Europe. Outside of those areas, however, mobile apps have evolved in a different way, a very different way. Starting in China and other parts of South Asia, we have what's known as a super app. A super app is a single app that does multiple things. And usually a super app has at its core some kind of messaging or social networking service and also some kind of payment service. And those two combined make it possible to do all kinds of transactions. And gradually that super app turns into a platform where third parties can start to build other apps. So you can think of a super app as an app store inside of an app, a single app that does it all. Maybe a Swiss Army knife of apps, if you will. This has enabled the companies that create super apps to grow to become the largest companies, the largest internet companies in their nations, respectively. Companies like Tencent that owns WeChat and Baidu in Japan, Gojek in Indonesia, and Paytm in India. These companies have expanded typically from a beginning app that includes some kind of messaging and some sort of payment system to a suite of apps inside of a single app that does everything. So it's like a one-stop shop. You don't need to leave that single app. Those are now starting to expand across South Asia and into Africa and into Latin America. And so there's a scenario where perhaps in the future, the big internet companies in the United States will also introduce their own version of a super app. And if you look at, for instance, Apple, you'll notice that Apple's had a huge focus on digital services. They now do have a payment service. They have a very robust messaging app. They also have a range of streaming media services, music, video, and so forth. And so you can start to see that Apple is assembling all the elements they might need to build their own super app. So that's a second scenario for the next 10 years. There's a third scenario. The third scenario is to build an entire digital world, a new world built in digital media. People in Silicon Valley are inspired by Kevin Kelly. Kevin Kelly is the founding editor of Wired magazine. And a few years ago, he wrote this really inspiring article called Mirror Worlds. And in that, he said something profoundly important I want to read to you. We are now at the dawn of the third platform, which will digitize the rest of the world. Whoever dominates this grand third platform will become among the wealthiest and most powerful people and companies in history. Let that sink in for a second. We're building a digital version of the real world. That's the third platform. The first platform is the web. The second platform is mobile. The third platform is a model of the entire world. And whoever builds that will become one of the wealthiest and most powerful companies in the world. Now, when I read that, I thought, wait a minute. Isn't Apple and Amazon and Google, aren't they already the wealthiest and most powerful companies in history? No, as it turns out, they're not. The most powerful companies in history were the very first modern corporations, the very first modern multinationals. They were the first companies that were backed by venture capital. They were the first publicly traded stocks, and they were the first globalizers. But they got their start 400 years ago. I'm talking, of course, about the United Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. These giant trading companies, which were started in 1600, these giant companies were among the first publicly traded companies. They were venture financed, and they were international globalizers. And they had a remarkable business model. They would subjugate entire nations, the population, the society, the economy, bend it to their will, dominate it, and extract profit from it. Their business model was to run worlds for profit. This is the inspiration for building these new worlds. Now, I happen to be quite concerned that we're about to encode colonial legacy into virtual worlds. The virtual worlds that we're hearing about right now, which are mostly games and things called the Metaverse, various visions of how those might unfold. But when you read about these things, something you'll notice is that there's no concept of digital citizenship or sovereignty or rights for the people who use these worlds. There's no self-determination. There's no kind of self-government. These are privately owned, privately managed businesses for profit. They're extremely centralized to a single company. Very often, for instance, in a game world, they will not allow you to do trade outside of the game. You can't exchange items. You can't take your items with you to another game and so forth. That's very akin to the way colonies were run 300 years ago. We also see that in these new digital worlds, there's algorithmic bias. And there's a real concern that artificial intelligence can develop its own set of biases against certain groups. Again, that's a characteristic of, that's kind of the legacy, if you will, of virtual worlds, this sense of racial bias or discrimination against different groups, ethnic groups, and indigenous groups. That's another hangover from that colonial era that still lingers in our society today. And then finally, the notion of the business model of a colonial world is to extract assets from that world, extract them for profit for shareholders in the corporation. And in some respects, that's also what's occurring in digital worlds today. But the data, the assets that are being extracted today aren't gold and minerals and agricultural products. What's being extracted today are data assets. What we're effectively doing in digital worlds is commoditizing human identity for profit. So in some ways, I am concerned that we might mindlessly replicate the colonial legacy in the virtual worlds we're building. And that brings me to Facebook. Famously, about a year ago, Mark Zuckerberg announced that in the next 5 years, Facebook would transition from being a social media company to a metaverse company, and he even changed the name of the company to Meta. So Mark is clearly excited about this idea of building a virtual world. In Facebook's case, it's called Horizon. And in my mind, this announcement reminds me of the evil emperor from the Star Wars trilogy, talking about building out the Death Star, in the sense that he's going to have this one weapon to control everybody. Bear that in mind when you hear about Meta. It sounds great, right, to build a VR world, but when you start to look a little more closely at their plans, there is some real cause for concern. Recently, about a month ago, the Financial Times wrote an article about Facebook's patents. Facebook had filed a raft of patents around virtual worlds. And while it's no guarantee that Facebook's going to use everything that's in these patents, it is quite telling to read the patents because it shows you what they're thinking about, where they think there'll be opportunity. And what Facebook's patents involve are capturing very detailed, very precise information at a very small scale. The ability to pick up things like your facial expression, facial details, your hair, your skin, even your skin color. They have a thing called Skin Replicator. They can track your body position, your body geometry, your size and weight, and so forth. You might wonder, why does Facebook need this kind of data? So the article in the Financial Times quoted Noel Martin, who's a researcher in Western Australia. And Noel Martin said, Meta aims to simulate you down to the skin pore. Every strand of hair, every micro movement, they're going to build a high fidelity replication of you. The objective is to create 3D replicas of people that are so hyper-realistic that they're indistinguishable from what is real. And he continued to say, in truth, they're undertaking a global human cloning program. Now, that may sound melodramatic to you when you hear it that way, but think about it. Facebook's business model is advertising. And if they can track you so well that they can build a high fidelity replica of you, they can start to use that high fidelity likeness of you. They can use it for testing. They can use it to test out advertising. They can train their artificial intelligence on it until they perfect offers that they know are going to compel you. And that'll be the advertising model that's introduced in these virtual worlds. And so in a respect, you can say that they're actually extracting data assets from you to build a version of you, basically a clone of you, that will be used without pay to train their AI. That, my friends, is a replication of the colonial era. Now consider another company in the space, Roblox. Roblox is often held up as a poster child, a vision of the fun version of the metaverse. Roblox is a game famously aimed at children. And as the head of marketing there said, from the very beginning, it was about having kids develop games for other kids, which sounds great until you watch the video that this is presented in. There's a video on YouTube called Investigation, how Roblox uses child labor to increase corporate value. And effectively, the charges that are set forth is that Roblox has built their empire with 40 million people playing that game. About 20% of them are building games, but most of them are not getting paid. And so now there've been a series of articles written, investigative journalism about Roblox's business model, which turns out to be really unfavorable. Young people are encouraged to come in, spend hours learning how to develop a game. That sounds great. You can say they're learning some skills that might be useful for them in the future. But Roblox goes further than that. They say that you can actually monetize games. You can make money making these games. Well, okay, great. That sounds good. Show me the money. Here's the problem. In order for your game to get listed, you actually have to put real dollars into their system and buy what they call Robux. Robux are their in-game currency. So you have to translate real cash money, real fiat currency, if you will, dollars, euros, whatever, into Robux, the in-game currency. And you have to buy advertising in order to get listed. Otherwise, your game will get buried in the millions of other games that are being developed by other people. So if you want your game to get discovered, you've got to invest a little bit of money. And then if you want to take money back out, let's say your game actually starts to earn money in that world. Well, they don't allow you to withdraw money until you reach the $1,000 threshold. Most games are never going to come anywhere near that. So you may have put in all this effort and even invest a little bit of money, and you'll never get your $1,000 back out. And even if you do cross that threshold, it turns out that they use an unfavorable exchange rate. So to get your $1,000 out, you have a less favorable exchange rate when you extract money back out, and you'll end up with far less than $1,000. So for these reasons and many others, critics claim that Roblox is using child labor to build their digital empire. So as you can see, there are some really grim ways to think about this future. This might not be the rosy scenario that many people are touting right now. The core issue is that in a corporate-owned, for-profit virtual world, we're not citizens. We don't have rights. We're subjects. What's missing is a Bill of Rights. What's missing is a constitution. What's missing is a declaration of the rights of man and woman and citizen. Those don't exist. Instead, what you get when you use a digital service is what we call a contract of adhesion. And you're familiar with these things. These are the click-through agreements that you have to accept every time you use any internet service. Some people call them click wrap. They're often known as a EULA, an end user license agreement, or a TOS, a terms of service, or a TOU, terms of use agreement, terms and conditions. We call these articles of adhesion or contracts of adhesion because they stick to you, but they don't stick to the other side. It's a one-way contract. The party that issues the contract is free to change the terms of those contracts at any time, and they do. They change them frequently. Of course, the contracts themselves are 30 or 40 pages long. Very few people are going to spend the time to read it, and even then, it's hard to understand exactly what's changed. So they have an information advantage over you, and they can change those contracts at any time. You don't have rights. There's no right of appeal. There's no right to go to a court and demand things be set differently. All you can do is quit that service. If you don't like it, you can leave it. The problem is in the metaverse, we're being invited to co-create the metaverse. They're asking us to work, just as Roblox is asking kids to help build these games. Well, in the virtual worlds that are coming, we're going to be co-creators. We're going to build things. We're going to own things. But you won't really have a true right of ownership. You won't be able to transfer those assets necessarily, depending on that EULA or the terms of use. So as you can see, even as these companies have grown to planetary scale, there are some real genuine concerns. And the concerns generally circle around this theme of centralization. The internet as originally intended is decentralized. And the architecture of the internet itself is decentralized, but the apps built on top of it now have become highly centralized. And the major scale global companies that I'm referring to in this presentation, they are very aware that market leaders have increasing returns. They're able to exert their power and drive a concentration of power so they can foist proprietary standards on the third-party developers, and they can also foist lock-in and switching costs on their users. They make it very difficult for people to switch out of these services. If you view this from outside the United States, it feels very much like a recap of colonialism. The idea that data assets are being extracted from populations around the world who have no say over how those data assets are used. And what they're sent back is a kind of AI imperialism, where artificial intelligence will decide what options your population gets to see. These are real serious perils of centralization. So it's time, I think, to decolonize the metaverse. And I've been in active discussions now with groups all over the world that want to actively do this. They want to start to posit a Bill of Rights or some kind of constitution for the metaverse. And this revolution needs you. This is a revolution where I think everybody needs to participate, because I think the thought of waking up in a world where $5 trillion companies or even $10 trillion companies dominate every aspect of the economy, I think that's quite a scary situation to consider, to contemplate. And so you can see one of the big themes coming in this decade is this tension between decentralization and re-centralization. The major internet companies want to continue to consolidate as much as they can under their control, but there are other forces advocating for decentralization. Let's take a look at those. So you probably have heard this term Web3. Web3 is the idea of the next wave of the internet technologies that are coming. Now, there's many different perspectives. This is a highly controversial topic, and there's no real general consensus around what the term Web3 might mean, but many, many people advocate that Web3 will be built on top of the decentralizing architecture that's used for cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. You see, with the advent of blockchain and Bitcoin back in 2009, there's been an ever expanding cone of possibility, a new way to conceptualize computing, network computing. The idea is that the blockchain itself can be viewed as a kind of world computer. And so with Ethereum and subsequent blockchains that have been introduced after Bitcoin, they began to look at the blockchain as a platform, a kind of decentralized platform that's spread across thousands of computers. And that decentralized platform cannot be controlled by any one entity. Rights cannot be revoked. It's immutable. The record is immutable. You can't rewrite it. So the idea of smart contracts running on top of these decentralized platforms gives us the opportunity to imagine a world of decentralized apps, oracles that correlate real world events with what's recorded on the blockchain. And recently, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about non-fungible tokens, which are digital assets that have scarcity. That scarcity itself is encoded in the blockchain. And now on the right side of my diagram, you can start to see some of the imaginative possibilities that are coming forth, not just Web3, but DAOs. And I want to talk a little bit about a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. The idea that superfan networks can start to arise, that can start to fund things instead of advertising. So some concept of using these technologies to build an alternative business model that does not rely on surveillance advertising as its business. Worlds of collaboration that are fueled and funded by token economies, and ultimately decentralized metaverses. There is a tremendous amount of activity occurring right now in this space. This is perhaps the most creative space that I've seen since the launch of mobile in the early 2000s. So now let's take a look at a DAO, a DAO. That is a decentralized autonomous organization. A moment ago, I talked to you about the world's largest corporations. The corporation is something that was invented during the colonial era and has persisted ever since. And corporations and global capitalism are interwoven. It's very hard for us to imagine a world where those two things don't exist. We think that they're interwoven and therefore inextricable. But that's not the case. It's possible to imagine other kinds of business structures. We just haven't had a technology for it yet. And now we do. The DAO, the DAO, is a decentralized business. So it's running on blockchain. It's decentralized in the sense that there is no one central hierarchy. It's autonomous in the sense that it's governed by smart contracts. There's no board of directors or C-suite or CEO giving instructions. Instead, it's a bottoms-up collective. That's what we call an organization, not a corporation. DAOs are characterized by running on open source software. There is no hierarchy. There's no top-down governance. They are owned by the community. Those who contribute own the most. They're accessible to anybody. Anyone can come and go as they please. They are geographically unbound. This is a fascinating concept. A DAO doesn't exist in a jurisdiction. It doesn't exist in a particular place. A DAO can exist anywhere and everywhere and nowhere in particular. And what DAO involves or offers is the potential for permissionless innovation. It's a voluntary society where people get involved in the community and they contribute software, marketing, design, or other services. There are even DAOs to serve other DAOs. In a way, you can think of this as a kind of a reinvention of a vision that Mikhail Bakunin had back in 1870 when he talked about collectivist anarchy. Now, today we use the word anarchy to mean disorder or chaos, but that's not exactly what they meant. In the 1870s, the anarchists were talking about organizations that did not have a king or a leader. They were leaderless. And we haven't really had a great model for what that might be. But now today with DAOs, we're starting to see how that might work when the workers truly own the means of production. So Web3 is decentralized infrastructure. The DAO is like the anti-corporation. It's the opposite of a top-down corporation controlled by shareholders and C-suite. It's an autonomous collective. NFTs, non-fungible tokens, those are digital assets. They're cryptographically secure because they're issued and tracked on the blockchain. Tokens, sometimes the same as an NFT, sometimes different. This provides an incentive structure that rewards contributors with voting power. Here's your rights. Here's your citizens' rights. The ability for people who contribute to have some say over how that platform evolves and the rights that they have inside of it. And finally, the data itself should be owned and controlled by the end user. These are the principles that are set forth in Web3 and the DAO. It's very early stage. Not all of this is working yet. But the point I want to draw your attention to is just to bring this back around. What we're really talking about here is a completely dematerialized vision of how companies and organizations can run in the future. The DAO is a dematerialized company, if you will. It's an uncompany, an anti-corporation, and it's running on top of dematerialized infrastructure. It issues dematerialized assets in the form of tokens, NFTs, and cryptocurrency. And those tokens provide for kind of dematerialized governance. You don't need a board of directors. You don't need a Congress. Every participant can vote according to their contributions. And finally, data is about dematerializing and decentralizing identity, giving the identity rights back to the individual user. So when we talk about decentralization, the folks who are involved in Web3 right now are very keenly embracing this concept as their core mantra. And already there are token economies emerging for a number of different fields. And this is actually really relevant to the folks who are listening to this talk today, because it does affect broadband and it does affect what happens on your networks. I'll show you an example in just a second. So today there are functioning token economies, largely in DeFi, decentralized finance, but also for content creation, the creation of digital assets. There are now decentralized social networks as alternatives to the highly centralized social networks from the 2000s and 2010s. You can also use decentralization and token economies for infrastructure, like shared computing power or data storage, identity management, data management, and network access. Let me talk a little bit about network access. If you haven't heard about Helium, I recommend that you check it out, because Helium is an example of a DAO that functions today. They're rolling out the first 5G network that is controlled and owned by consumers. This is a radical notion. Basically, anyone can purchase a hotspot and participate in this network. And those hotspots are all part of a mesh network. And that mesh network tracks activity. So if you're providing connectivity to other people from your own hotspot in your home or in your business or in some other residence or some other premises that you happen to own, if you provide a hotspot that people are using, you're going to earn coins, you're going to earn tokens inside of this economy. And so they've created a virtual economy, a token economy, to govern a 5G rollout. And by the way, this is working very well now. They've partnered with a number of companies, including T-Mobile, to roll this out. And Dish Network is also a partner of theirs. And as you can see, it's kind of a hybrid blend on the left side of a peer-to-peer network, distributed IoT network that's running on LoRa. The nodes are all connected via a blockchain, but it's a green blockchain. It's a very energy efficient blockchain. So it's not as inefficient as you may have heard about Ethereum and Bitcoin and so forth. And then on the right side, it's a very typical internet network setup with network servers and application servers and so forth. What they're doing is dematerializing and democratizing access to the network. Helium is not the only example. As you can see here, there are more than 100 DAOs have been created in the past 2 years, and there will be 1,000 by the end of this year. This is the hottest area of innovation right now in technology. And so I'm joking a little bit when I say the revolution needs you, but actually, folks, it really does. This is a choice. Remember, the future is a decision. It's a process. It's a work in progress. And you get to make a decision. You can choose to live in a world dominated by $5 trillion companies that suck up your data and dictate what choices you get, or you can choose to live in a world where you participate and are rewarded based on your participation. And you'll have rights to determine how those organizations are governed. And remember, when we talk about dematerialization and building virtual worlds and virtual things, replacing physical things with software, we're talking about building models. And as the mathematician George Box once said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And the art is understanding how they're useful. And so in closing, I want to offer this question. When you think about your software model that you're building on top of your network, ask yourself, which values are being optimized and which values are being minimized? Because we always optimize for certain values. A market economy optimizes for efficiency, and it minimizes the value of equality. A globalized economy will optimize for scale and minimize the value of local community. We've seen the impact of that ourselves in the past 15 years. An information economy will optimize data collection and surveillance, and it'll minimize the value of privacy. An attention economy will optimize for narcissism, and it minimizes the value of consensus. So we've also seen the destructive effect of that model. So which values are optimized in the systems that you're building? This is a choice that we get to make. This is the future that lies ahead of us. On the left side, you've seen that we've optimized over the last 20 years for concentration and global scale and inequality and exploitation, extraction of data. Perhaps in the Web3 world, we'll optimize for a different set of values: the diffusion of power, the inclusion and cultivation of local flavor and local cultures, fairness, incentives for cooperation instead of coercion, and incentives for creation. So as you can see, these giant trends, dematerialization, decentralization, and democratization, I believe are going to characterize what happens. It's a struggle. It's not a foregone conclusion. It's a process, but there are many, many companies, many different organizations vying to influence that future trajectory. I'm Rob Tercek, and I'm the author of the book Vaporized, and it has been my pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you all very much for listening. And if there are questions now, Lee, I'd be very happy to take them.